I never thought I'd spend 3 nights parked outside my own house, watching a stranger walk around inside like he paid the mortgage. My name is Ray Callahan. I'm 52 years old, and I work as a regional sales rep for an industrial equipment company based out of Columbus, Ohio. The job sounds boring, and honestly, most of the time it is. I drive a territory that covers Ohio, Indiana, and Kentucky factory floors, warehouse managers, purchasing departments. I'm on the road roughly 18 days out of every month. Have been for 11 years. My wife, Donna, took our daughter and moved to her sister's place in Raleigh about 4 years ago. She said she was tired of being a single parent in a 2-income house. She wasn't wrong. I kept the house in Westerville, a 3-bedroom colonial I bought when I still believed I'd be home for dinner most nights. It's too big for one person, but I never got around to downsizing. That house was the last thing that felt like mine. That's what makes what happened so hard to explain to people who haven't experienced it. It wasn't just a crime. It was someone reaching into the one place I thought no one could touch. It started with a voicemail I almost didn't listen to. I was sitting in a Cracker Barrel parking lot outside of Terre Haute, eating a sandwich in my car between appointments, when I scrolled past a missed call from a number I didn't recognize. Local Columbus area code. I almost deleted it. Instead, I hit play. The voice belonged to a woman named Renee Strickland. She introduced herself as the HOA treasurer for my neighborhood, Mallard Creek Estates. Her tone was careful, the way people sound when they're delivering news they'd rather not deliver. "Mr. Callahan, I'm sorry to bother you. I got your number from the community directory. I wanted to reach out because something came to my attention this week, and I thought you should know before I filed anything officially. Your gas and electric usage for the past 2 months has been significantly higher than your historical average. We noticed it through the utility reporting system we use to flag potential code violations. I don't want to alarm you, but given that you travel frequently, I think most of the neighborhood knows your schedule. I thought you'd want to hear about it directly first." I called her back immediately. She told me the spike had started around 8 weeks earlier, nearly double my normal usage in September, then up another 30% in October. She said one of my neighbors, an older retired guy named Frank Adler who lived 2 doors down, had mentioned seeing a car in my driveway on multiple evenings. He'd assumed it was a family member staying over while I was away. Renee hadn't thought much of it at first either, but the utility numbers bothered her enough to make the call. I told her nobody should be in that house. Nobody had a key except my cleaning service, and they only came twice a month. There was no family member staying over. There was no friend with a spare key. There was nothing. There was a long pause on her end. "Mr. Callahan, I think you should come home." I cut my week short and drove back to Westerville the next day. I didn't call anyone. I didn't announce anything. Something in my gut told me to be quiet about it. I've been in sales long enough to know that the moment you tip your hand, the other person starts adjusting their story. I got home around 9 in the evening. I parked 2 streets over and walked. My neighborhood is flat and tree-lined, and October had stripped most of the leaves, so I had a clear sight line to my property from the corner. Everything looked normal at first. Porch light on, curtains closed, garage door down, the kind of normal that's supposed to make you feel relieved. Then the kitchen light turned on. I stood there on the sidewalk in the dark and watched a shadow move across my kitchen window. Unhurried, comfortable. Whoever was in there wasn't panicking, wasn't hiding, wasn't searching for something to steal. They were just moving through the kitchen the way a person moves through a kitchen when they think nobody is watching. I stood there for maybe 15 minutes. I know I should have called the police right then. Believe me, I've thought about that decision 100 times since. But I thought about what Renee had said, that this had been going on for 8 weeks. This wasn't a random break-in. Someone had been using my house for 2 months without me noticing. If I called the police and they knocked on that door, and whoever was inside said they had permission, that they were a friend staying over, it would become a he said, she said situation, with no evidence behind me. I'm a sales rep. I know how easily a story can be disputed when you don't have documentation. So I drove to a Hampton Inn near the highway, and spent the night lying awake in a room that smelled like industrial carpet cleaner, running through everything I knew. The next morning I went to a Best Buy and bought 2 indoor wireless cameras and a video doorbell, the kind that records to a cloud server automatically, so even if someone found the hardware and smashed it, the footage would still exist. I also picked up a prepaid tablet to monitor the feeds remotely. I drove back to my house around 11 in the morning. Frank Adler told me later that the car, a silver Chevy Malibu he didn't recognize, usually showed up in the early evenings and was gone by 7 or 8 the next morning. I had a window. Walking into my own house felt wrong in a way I still can't fully articulate. My key still worked. The alarm code still worked. Nothing was broken. Nothing was visibly disturbed. But standing in my own foyer, I knew immediately that someone else had been living there. The air was different. There was a faint smell of food I hadn't cooked. A pair of shoes near the door that weren't mine. Dark sneakers, men's, maybe a size 10. I walked through slowly. In the kitchen, the dish rack had 2 plates and a coffee mug in it that I didn't own. There was a half-empty bottle of hot sauce in my fridge that I'd never bought. My groceries, a 12-pack I'd left before my last trip, a few frozen meals, some condiments had been picked through, not cleaned out, used. The way you use your own food when you live somewhere. In the living room, the couch blanket I kept folded over the back was now draped across the cushions, the way someone leaves it when they've been sitting under it watching TV. The TV remote was on the wrong side of the coffee table. Small things. The kind of things that only look wrong when you know exactly how you left them. The guest bedroom was the worst. I use that room for storage mostly. Boxes from the move, some gym equipment I keep meaning to set up, a spare dresser. Someone had cleared a path through the boxes to the closet. Inside the closet, pushed to one side, was a duffel bag that didn't belong to me, a toothbrush and shaving kit on the dresser, a phone charger plugged into the wall outlet, a folded t-shirt on top of the dresser. Someone had made themselves a bedroom in my storage room. I stood in that doorway for a long time. Not angry yet, just stunned. There's a specific feeling that comes with realizing a stranger has been sleeping under your roof, breathing your air, opening your refrigerator every night for 2 months while you drove across Indiana selling conveyor systems. It isn't just violation. It's something closer to vertigo. I set up the cameras quickly. One in the living room tucked on the bookshelf behind some old manuals, angled toward the front door. One in the kitchen above the cabinets with a clear view of the entryway and dining area. The doorbell camera outside. I didn't touch the duffel bag. I didn't move anything. I left the house exactly as I found it, locked up, and drove back to the hotel. At 5:22 that evening, my phone buzzed with a doorbell alert. I opened the app and watched a man walk up my front path. White male, I'd put him around 40, maybe 45. Medium build, wearing a gray fleece and jeans, carrying a reusable grocery bag in one hand and a backpack in the other. He moved casually, no hesitation, like a man coming home after work. He pulled a key from his jacket pocket, my key, and let himself in. I watched through the kitchen camera as he unpacked the grocery bag. He put things in my refrigerator. He took off his jacket and hung it on the hook by the back door, the hook where I hang my jacket. He opened a cabinet and took out a glass, one of my glasses, filled it with water from my tap, and drank it standing at my kitchen counter the way I do every single morning. I recorded everything. Over the next 4 days, I documented his routine. He arrived between 5 and 6 in the evening. He'd cook in my kitchen, watch television in my living room, sleep in the guest room. He was tidy, which somehow made it worse. He washed his dishes. He didn't tear through my belongings or rifle through my closets, at least not that I could see. He was just living there, quietly, carefully, as if he understood that the point was not to get caught. On the 3rd day, something changed. At 7:15 the evening, my doorbell camera caught a woman approaching the house. Late 30s, dark hair, professional looking, carrying a leather portfolio under one arm. She knocked. Through the interior camera, I watched the man answer the door and let her in. They greeted each other with the familiarity of colleagues. They sat at my dining room table, and she opened the portfolio and spread papers across the surface. I zoomed in. The camera quality wasn't perfect, but I could see they were going through some kind of documentation together. Spreadsheets, it looked like. She had a laptop with her, and she turned it toward him at one point, and even at that resolution I could make out what was on the screen. It was a booking platform. The calendar layout, the pricing fields, the listing photos. The listing photos were of my house. My hands were shaking by the time I opened a browser and typed my home address into Verbo's search bar. There it was. Spacious Westerville home, perfect for business travelers and extended stays. 6 photographs. My living room, my kitchen, my backyard patio, the guest bedroom, staged to look like a proper guest room. The listing had been active for 11 weeks. Nightly rate, $195. Minimum stay, 3 nights. There were 9 reviews, every one of them 5 stars. Comments about the comfortable beds, the well-equipped kitchen, the convenient location near the highway. One reviewer wrote, Host was great with communication and made check-in seamless. Host. They were calling this man the host of my house. I scrolled through everything twice. Then I took screenshots until my phone ran out of storage space. I kept watching the cameras. The woman stayed for about 90 minutes. Before she left, they stood at the front door, and I caught enough of the conversation through the doorbell microphone to get what I needed. She said something about the next guests arriving Thursday. He said he'd confirm with someone named Dennis about the key. She mentioned that they needed to be careful about February because the owner was apparently harder to track than their other properties. Other properties. I went back to the footage of the man's arrivals and departures and started paying close attention to everything I'd missed. On day 2, around noon earlier than his usual arrival time, a different vehicle had stopped in front of my house briefly. Not parked, just idled at the curb. A man got out, walked up to the front door, and exchanged something with the person inside. It happened in under a minute. I paused the footage and zoomed in on the man at the curb. He was wearing a polo shirt with a logo on the chest. I enhanced it as much as the image quality allowed. It looked like a broom in a house, a cleaning company logo. I searched cleaning services in Westerville and spent 20 minutes going through logos before I found it. Bright Home Services. The company I paid to clean my house twice a month. The company that had a spare key to my property. The company that knew my travel schedule because I always texted them when I was heading out so they could arrange access. I sat in that hotel room for a long time after I figured it out. The cleaning company had a key. The cleaning company knew when I'd be gone. Somebody at Bright Home Services had sold that information or sold that key, or both to the man who had been sleeping in my guest room for 11 weeks. I called my contact at Bright Home Services the next morning, a manager named Gary who I dealt with for 3 years. I didn't tell him what I knew. I just asked casually whether there had been any staff turnover recently, whether anyone new had been assigned to my property. He said they'd brought on a few new guys in August. I asked if one of them might have been named Dennis. Gary went quiet for a moment. He said there was a Dennis Pruitt who'd been assigned to several properties in my area, but that he'd actually called in sick and stopped showing up about 3 weeks ago. Convenient timing, I thought. I called Renee Strickland next and asked her whether any other homeowners in Mallard Creek had reported unusual utility spikes or noticed unfamiliar cars in driveways. She said she'd ask around quietly. She called me back 2 hours later. 2 other households had mentioned it, both owned by people who traveled frequently for work. One of them had actually logged a question with Bright Home Services about a different car being parked in their driveway on a day the cleaning crew wasn't scheduled. I had enough. I walked into the Columbus Division of Police the following morning with my tablet, a printed summary of everything I'd documented, and a folder of screenshots. The detective who took my report was a methodical man named Harrington, who listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and then went through my footage for 45 minutes before he said anything. "Mr. Callahan, this is organized. This isn't one guy squatting. This is an operation." He looked up from the tablet. "How many properties did you say they mentioned?" "At least 3, I told him. "Maybe more. All of them in the same HOA management area. All of them belonging to frequent travelers with cleaning service contracts." Detective Harrington brought in a second detective at that point. They asked me to keep monitoring my cameras and not to change my locks or alert the suspects yet. They needed time to identify everyone involved, pull the financial records from the rental platform, and build a case that would hold up in court. I agreed, though every instinct I had wanted to drive to my own house and throw that duffel bag into the street. Over the following 10 days, while I sat in the Hampton Inn running my sales calls by phone and watching my house on a tablet screen, Detective Harrington's team did their work. They identified the man in the gray fleece as a guy named Marcus Webb, who, according to his online presence, operated a small property management consulting business. His LinkedIn profile described him as specializing in short-term rental arbitrage and property monetization. Arbitrage. That was the word he used, as if what he was doing to people's homes was a financial strategy and not a crime. The woman with the leather portfolio turned out to be his business partner, a woman named Christine Oglesby, who handled the listing management, the photography, the guest communications, the platform accounts. She had set up a business profile on the rental platform under a company name Keystone Extended Stays that looked completely legitimate at first glance. Dennis Pruitt, the cleaning service employee who'd stopped showing up to work, was the inside man. He had provided keys and occupancy schedules for at least 8 properties across 3 different cleaning service routes. In exchange, he received 15% of the booking revenue for every property he contributed to the rotation. The scheme had been running for just under 6 months. Marcus and Christine had made over $94,000. The sting happened on a Tuesday evening. Detective Harrington called me that afternoon and told me to come to a staging point 3 blocks from my house. I was there when the officers approached my front door. Marcus Webb answered in my kitchen and looked out through the glass panel at the side of the door and saw the badges. The expression on his face was the face of someone doing a very quick and very futile calculation. Christine Oglesby was arrested at her apartment the same evening. Dennis Pruitt was picked up at his new job. He'd found work at another cleaning company in Hilliard 2 days later. I went back into my house that night for the first time in almost 2 weeks. The detective had already authorized it after the scene was cleared. I walked through every room. Marcus's things were still in the guest closet. His shaving kit was still on the dresser. There were guest-supplied towels on the bathroom rail that didn't belong to me. A partial package of coffee in my cabinet that I hadn't bought. An umbrella by the back door that wasn't mine. I stood in my own kitchen at 11 at night and felt nothing that resembled relief. I felt tired, and I felt angry, and I felt the particular loneliness of a house that has been occupied by strangers for months and still somehow feels emptier now that they're gone. Marcus Webb was charged with breaking and entering, fraud over $10,000, theft of utility services, and conspiracy. Christine Oglesby faced charges of fraud, conspiracy, and money laundering for her role in collecting and distributing the rental payments. Dennis Pruitt was charged with theft, breach of fiduciary duty, and conspiracy. All 3 entered pleas, and all 3 were convicted. Marcus received 22 months. Christine received 16 months. Dennis, who cooperated with investigators and provided detailed records of every property he'd compromised, received a suspended sentence and 3 years probation. The other property owners, there were 6 of us in total, each received a portion of the restitution order. My share came to just over $12,000. It covered the cost of replacing every lock in my house, installing a proper security system, 3 weeks of hotel bills, and a fraction of the rental income that had been generated from my property without my knowledge or consent. The math of it will never fully balance out. What the money doesn't cover is the part nobody talks about when they report on these kinds of cases. It doesn't cover the 3 months after the arrest when I found myself checking the camera app compulsively, sometimes 6 or 7 times a day, every time I pulled out of my driveway. It doesn't cover the week. I came home from a long run and stood outside my own front door for 10 minutes before I could make myself go in. It doesn't cover the conversation I had with my daughter on the phone when she called because she'd seen the news story, and I had to explain to a 23-year-old who already thought her father was never home, that the home he was never at had been rented out to strangers the whole time. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Dad, are you okay?" I told her I was. I'm still working on making that true. Bright Home Services was investigated by the Ohio Attorney General's office for negligence in their key management and employee screening practices. They settled with the affected homeowners out of court. The settlement amounts were confidential. They are still operating, under new management, and with a stated policy of background checks and key accountability logs. I no longer use a cleaning service. I also filed a complaint with Verbo and the other rental platforms about how the listings had been created. Marcus and Christine had used falsified documents to establish account ownership and had routed payments through a business account that appeared entirely legitimate. The platforms cooperated with law enforcement, but the process exposed something uncomfortable. It is not particularly difficult to list a property you don't own on a short-term rental platform. The verification systems are designed to protect guests from fraud, not to protect homeowners from having their properties listed without their knowledge. There is no mechanism that automatically confirms whether the person creating a listing has legal authority over that property. The other homeowners in our group pursued a civil suit against Bright Home Services, in addition to the criminal restitution. I joined it. We settled. I can't say how much. What I can say is that it felt like the closest thing to accountability from the system that enabled the crime, not just the people who committed it. I still live in the house in Westerville. I thought about selling, the same way you think about quitting after a bad year. But I'd bought that house with 11 years of sales commissions and late nights and weekends away from my daughter, and I wasn't going to let Marcus Webb's scheme take it from me on top of everything else it had already taken. What I did instead was learn. The first thing I learned is that a locked door means almost nothing if other people have keys to it and knowledge of your schedule. I replaced every lock in the house with smart locks that generate temporary access codes. The cleaning service is gone. The neighbor who has my emergency contact is Frank Adler, who I now have a proper conversation with every time I see him. He has my cell number, he has my daughter's number. He has explicit instructions. If there is a car in my driveway that he doesn't recognize and he knows I'm out of town, he calls me first, not the HOA. The second thing I learned is that monitoring your utilities is not something you do when there's a problem. It's something you do every month, the same way you check your bank statements. I now get weekly utility reports sent to my email. I have a baseline number in my head. Anything above it gets a phone call to my smart thermostat app to see whether something is running that shouldn't be. The third thing I learned is to search your own address on every major rental platform at least twice a year. Type in your street address. See what comes up. It feels paranoid the first time you do it. It feels necessary every time after that. The fourth thing, and this is the one I think about most, is that the vulnerability wasn't my locks, or my doors, or my security system. The vulnerability was my trust. I had paid a company to have access to my property, and I had never once verified how they stored my key, who had access to it, whether employees were screened, or what their protocols were when a key went missing. I handed a stranger a key to my house, and considered the transaction complete. I never thought about what happened to that key on its way through the organization, how many hands it passed through, how much information about my schedule traveled with it. Dennis Pruitt knew when I'd be gone for 3 days versus 2 weeks. He knew my approximate return dates. He had passed that information to Marcus Webb with the same casualness as sharing a phone number. My schedule, my absence, my home, it was data to him. A commodity, a tool for someone else's profit. I drove past a house on my street last week that had a for sale sign in the yard. New family moved in over the summer, and now they're leaving already. I don't know their story. But I thought about what Renee Strickland's phone call had meant to me, and I knocked on their door and introduced myself. Told them I was their neighbor and that I traveled frequently. Gave them my number. Told them if anything ever seemed off a car they didn't recognize, lights that shouldn't be on, anything to call me. They looked at me like I was a little strange. Maybe I am now. Maybe that's the cost. You hand a key to someone you think you can trust, and they hand it to someone who has no idea who you are, and no reason to care, and before long there's a stranger sleeping in your guest room while you're driving through Indiana thinking your house is empty and safe. And the thing about that particular kind of violation is that you can fix the locks and change the codes and install every camera on the market, and you will still lie awake some nights listening to the sounds of a house you're not entirely sure is yours anymore. The cameras help. The smart locks help. The neighbor with my number helps. But the thing that helps most is knowing I didn't let it go. I sat in a parking lot and chose documentation over confrontation. I spent 3 weeks in a hotel room I didn't want to be in to build a case that prosecutors could actually use. I testified at the sentencing hearing and looked at Marcus Webb and Christine Oglesby and Dennis Pruitt directly and said what had been taken from me in terms they couldn't dispute because I had 40 hours of footage that said it for me. Your home isn't an asset on a balance sheet. It isn't a line item in someone's arbitrage strategy. It's the place you come back to after 18 days on the road, the place that's supposed to feel like yours no matter how long you've been away. If you travel for work, install cameras now, before there's a reason to. Monitor your utilities. Know your neighbors by name. Ask the hard questions of every company that holds a key to your property. Search your own address on every rental platform you've heard of. And if something feels wrong, an unexplained bill, a neighbor's offhand comment, a car that keeps showing up when you're supposed to be gone, don't rationalize it away. Don't assume there's a simple explanation. Follow the thread wherever it goes, because the people who counted on me not to follow it came closer to getting away with it than I'm comfortable admitting. They bet on my absence. They bet on my trust. They bet on the fact that a man who's never home might not notice the signs that his home was never really empty. They were almost right.